Hello, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone. Thanks for joining our weekly live stream today. I'm excited for today's conversation. We're going to talk about a topic that I've really been diving deep into, just trying to understand and unpack in my own mind quite a bit lately. And I'm excited to have our guest on to discuss this in more detail. But it's the topic of intellectual property. And when I first heard this term and when I first talked to our guest about this concept a couple years ago, I thought it was a very legalese sort of term that only attorneys really cared about. Maybe those of us that deal with attorneys would care about. But the more I see the enterprise tech space unfold here, the more I realize intellectual property is a really big deal in today's day and age of cloud ERP, AI technology, cybersecurity, data. There's just a lot to unpack here, and it's not just a legal issue. You don't have to be in litigation to be concerned about these things. These are concerns that I think every executive should have as they enter their digital transformations, the way they protect their intellectual property, the way they protect their competitive advantages, and the way they just act as good stewards of their own organizations. And sometimes doing that is in conflict with what software vendor best interests are. So I want to talk about that in a lot more detail here today. But to help me unpack this topic is Marcus Harris, who's a software attorney. And you've been on the show more than any guest, I think. I think you still hold the mantle for most appearances on this podcast. So thanks for being here today, Marcus.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I always enjoy talking to you, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be the most frequent guest on your show. And we always have good conversations. And I think we were talking a little bit before we jumped on here, and I think we could talk about these things for hours. And we probably should have recorded some of our conversation previously, but I'm excited to talk about those things. My name is Marcus Harris. I'm a software and technology attorney with a particular focus on drafting and negotiating ERP-related contracts and litigating failed ERP projects and digital transformations, really nationwide, in courts and before arbitration panels. And I think I was in-house at a couple of software companies, SAP and Infor, early in my career. And so, I got a little bit of a unique perspective on some of these issues and the way that the vendors typically will look at these issues. And today, my practice, we're on the other side of these transactions on a consistent basis, both transactionally, contract negotiation-wise, and litigation-wise. So, I hope we can bring some value here. These are great topics. Well, it's a great topic and I think incredibly timely for people to have an understanding of the risks and issues associated with their data and intellectual property.
Yeah. In fact, it's so much fun to talk about that. As you said, before we went live, we looked up and all of a sudden realized we had been talking and we're 15 minutes late going live here on air because we were just chit-chatting and talking about all the stuff that we're about to talk about right now. So anyway, we're both very passionate about it. I know you are, Marcus, and I love having you on the show because you have an uncanny way of being able to explain this stuff to the layman, someone who's not an attorney, to understand it in a different way. But before we get into some of the questions I've got, and I also want to hear from the audience too, any questions you have for Marcus or I related to this topic here today, please drop those in the chat. I'll keep an eye on all the streams that we're streaming here today, TikTok, YouTube, LinkedIn, etc., Facebook, X. We're streaming to a lot of different platforms. So drop in the chat any questions you have. And also, if you don't mind, just dropping in the chat what city and country you're joining from today. It's always good to see where in the world everyone's at. But before we get into some of the questions from the audience and myself, I know, Marcus, you've been doing this for 20 years, negotiating tech contracts, litigating failed ERP projects. You also worked in-house as internal legal counsel, both at SAP and Infor.
Yeah.
And from that vantage point, what do most companies fundamentally misunderstand about who owns their IP once they move to the cloud?
Yeah, I think companies really fundamentally misunderstand that this concept of moving to the cloud really means, in a very real way, that they're giving up control. Okay, they're giving up control of what I would view as their most valuable commodity, which is their intellectual property. They're relying on the processes that have been in place by whatever ERP vendor they're utilizing, whatever third-party vendors that ERP is utilizing. And I think you've got to conceptualize this as, you're renting infrastructure or software to some extent, right? But in reality, you look at the way that these vendors deal with this cloud scenario, and you've got kind of this layered ownership of, I'd say layered ownership and control of your intellectual property, the way that their intellectual property integrates with your data. You've got concepts associated with licensing back your customer data, meaning that you enter in your proprietary information, customer data into the system, you give a license to that vendor to utilize it, which is going to be very broad in scope, and they're going to be able to do fundamentally different things than you're actually realizing that they can do because of the nature of that license grant. They're able to create potentially derivative works of that material. They're able to use it to train their models on, and so you've got this kind of layered system of what you actually retain control of your data to do, in really a loss of control. And I think that fundamentally is not something that anybody's really thinking about. They think, well, it's our system, it's our software, we utilize it in a certain way, and it's our data. Yeah, but you've just given up control, and it may not even be an issue associated with ownership. I think the fact that you own it is probably fundamentally sound, though there's nuances that we can talk about with respect to that. But it's who controls what you do with that data, and what kind of charge or fee or revenue generating event is there for you accessing data that's in your ERP system just by the fact that it's in the ERP system. When you look at lawsuits filed against SAP and others, where that has become a fundamental issue.
Right. Yeah. It's there's a lot there. There's a lot of follow-up that I want to get to related to that. And I think too, a lot of times when we're working with clients, a lot of times executives have this misnomer, this false belief that, the software is going to solve our problems in terms of giving us the answer in terms of how our processes should work, how our workflow should work, et cetera. And while that's true to some degree, it's giving you a tool set that might make your processes better. Just there's a fine line between leveraging the strengths of a software versus completely handing over control of your own operations and your workflows to software vendors. And it's a fascinating dynamic. It's sort of an organizational, not a dysfunction necessarily, but an organizational behavior sort of thing where executives want easy, technologists want to sell easy to the executives, and it all sounds good to everyone until you realize, wait, we no longer have control over our own operations, our own workflows, because now the vendors they're going to upgrade the technologies in what you think is going to be a good way going forward, but it may or may not be aligned with what you need longer term. So I think that's the control thing that's hard to see until you get into it.
Yeah, and I think you've got to anticipate that and have people on your team that understand that that's a possibility, and try to contract around that. The goal is, in any contract that I negotiate, is to maintain as much flexibility as possible. You want all the indicia of ownership of that data, of that intellectual property, of the tool that you're accessing and utilizing, the software tool, the ERP set, without actually owning it. And that's a fine line to walk. If there's some key process that is important to your business, that the software has specific functionality that gives you a competitive advantage or is critical to your business, and because this is in the cloud, that functionality is modified, it's diminished in some way, or it's just different, that blows out that particular business process for you. What do you do, right?
Yeah.
You just spent hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars on a piece of software functionality, and now it's changed, and that fundamentally impacts the way that you do business. You've got to account for that. And that goes beyond just owning the particular data or the intellectual property, but it goes to what you were saying about workflows and processes.
Yeah, and it's interesting because when I first hear the term IP, I think data. I think competitive intelligence, like information about your customer list or your product information, really sensitive proprietary type stuff. When I hear IP, I think that, but there's also another layer that's a little less cut and dry. And this is part of what we were talking about before we went live, is you've got like the clear IP type stuff that if someone steals your customer records or information, that's clear IP violation and clear IP legal issues. But what we're talking about here is a little more nuance, where it's like the vendors probably aren't going to get sued for taking your IP, but you're unknowingly giving them control over your IP in a lot of different ways. Right. What do you think about that?
Well, I think, look, you can break this down into a few buckets, right, of what kind of control you're giving up. And I think you're giving up broad rights to really use, analyze, and in some ways aggregate your own data and your own workflows, right? There's going to be some sort of implicit or even explicit license for that vendor to use your configurations, your custom reports, whatever kind of process mappings that you've got. They have the ability to utilize that. And if it's not explicit in the contract, there's certainly going to be some sort of implicit right for them to utilize it. And you may not know what they're using it for. And I think, it's an issue of giving up control of your intellectual property, proprietary information, data, trade secrets. And to the extent that they're going to use all of that information to train their artificial intelligence models, I mean, that's got huge implications for not only for your competitiveness, for the viability of your trade secrets, and really even potentially the ownership of your intellectual property. And that's without them taking it. It's not a misappropriation. I mean, they're utilizing it, and there aren't the appropriate safeguards around it to in many ways, to ensure that you've got not only ownership but control. And I think control is the big issue here.
Yeah, it is. And one of the interesting cases that you and I were talking about before we went live here today was the SAP EU settlement agreement that just went into effect earlier this month, or maybe it was last month, I can't remember. Just in the last few weeks, they agreed to a settlement where the EU essentially was able to extract certain concessions from SAP in terms of how they handle third-party maintenance and some of the restrictions that SAP had related to leveraging third-party maintenance and the way they were back charging customers and that sort of thing. So that's maybe not intellectual property per se, but it's on the same, it's along the same lines in terms of control. How much influence and control should a vendor have over your own operations and your own decisions versus you yourself? And what's interesting, and I'd be curious to get your take on this, since you've been on both sides of the equation here, vendor side and customer side, it seems like in a lot of ways, customers are allowing and giving legal rights to vendors that are allowing them to have more control. Is that right? Or is there a gray area here where there might be litigation that comes out of this longer term?
Well, I mean, I think there's a gray area, and I think companies that are savvy are going to focus on control and ownership of data and intellectual property, focusing on control of inputs and outputs with respect to artificial intelligence tools specifically. And I think that's the right way to go about it. But really, the issue is you're giving up the right to control what happens to your data, and you just, I mean, fundamentally, you just are. That's the nature of the relationship, right? And you look at this kind of on a pendulum here. I mean, you develop something in house and it's all yours. Okay, well, some people do that. We've got an on-premise system that's stored on your space or in your space. With your data in there, it's pretty controlled. Then you give up a huge aspect of the control of your proprietary information, data, trade secrets, and intellectual property when it all goes into the cloud. And I think if you're focused really, on price, on discounts, time to value, how fast the implementation is going to take, adopting so-called best practices, vanilla out-of-the-box systems. If that's what you're focused on, I mean, you're going to have a rude awakening when there is some sort of a dispute about, what can I do with my data?
Mm-hmm.
How do I utilize it internally or even externally? And what other systems can come into that ERP software, access my data, be assured there's going to be a charge for it, right? And where's the value add? It's just, I don't know. It's just there and it's in their ERP system. So they own it, and now system that is, and they control the access to your data. And again, you've got to account for that contractually and try to minimize the impact for that, because as many revenue generating events as that vendor can create, be assured that they will do that. And so the loss of control, I think, has massive implications, and revenue generating events is just one of them.
Yeah, absolutely. And there's another issue I think here that's similar in that, and this is and I can't remember if I don't think you and I have talked about this yet on a podcast in the past because it is relatively new, but SAP recently also published a new API policy that somewhat limits how customers can access and integrate with data that resides in S/4HANA. And in particular, they're essentially what they're doing, in my opinion, is that they are limiting integration to SAP sanctioned products. So if it's a product like, for example, Celonis is involved in litigation right now with SAP because Celonis is suing SAP saying, hey, you used to let our product access data in your system. Now you're excluding us ever since you bought one of our competitors, which is true. They did buy a competitor called Signavio.
Right.
Ever since SAP bought Signavio, then they've since clarified their API policy for security purposes, which I'm calling BS on. That is not why they're doing it. In my personal opinion, I know you can't validate that or not because you're an attorney, Marcus, but my opinion is SAP is doing it because they want you to double down on the SAP ecosystem of SAP sanctioned products. They don't want you using a third-party competitor to integrate with SAP data. So the reason I bring this up is because it does beg the question. I've gotten into debates with people in the SAP community about this. Is it really SAP's data or is it the customer's data to make decisions on how you can or can't access that? And maybe part two of that, if you do have an opinion, or if you're able to provide an opinion, is security enough of a concern that SAP would have the right to say, Mr. or Mrs. Customer, you're not smart enough to make good security decisions for yourself, so we're going to make that for you? And I know that's a very loaded question. That's a totally biased way of asking the question, but,
Yeah.
but I just want to
it is, but I think you're right on. And look, I'm right there with you. I think the Celonis case is really a canary in the coal mine. You look at that and you see exactly what they are trying to do. This new API policy is another one where, again, and I feel like I'm sounding like a broken record here, but it's all about control and being able to leverage your access to your own data. SAP doesn't own that data. They own the infrastructure in which the data resides. And I think that fundamentally gives them a leg up over you, even though it's your data, right? And I think, to answer your question specifically, does security give them, some kind of fundamental right to dictate, how you can utilize or access your data? Well, I think it's a cover, to be quite honest with you. I really do. I mean, I think, are there legitimate concerns there? Certainly. But for them to dictate specifically, that you can only use SAP partners or SAP approved providers, that's, I think, problematic. And I think, it's done not, for your benefit, which it's done under the cover of, right? Okay, here's the data security issue and we're helping you out there, but it's done for their benefit to, put as many controls over that system and your data as they possibly can, and to extract as much revenue from that access as they can. And in fact, this is so rampant right now. I actually had an SAP employee reach out to me and call me, kind of a whistleblower type thing, and just kind of alert me as to what what SAP is doing and kind of where they're at. I don't know what I can do with this information, but I mean, I think it's interesting that they don't, even their own people to some extent don't see where the value add here is and think it's problematic and not good for their customers. That's pretty telling.
Yeah. And I think, these are all, when we talk about these things, I think it's important to set the context of why it's so important. I mean, to be clear, I'm not suggesting in any of these conversations or these risks, the risks that we're identifying, I'm not saying that necessarily means that you should not deploy SAP or you should not deploy an ERP system of choice. But I think it's important to understand what the motives are of the software vendors and to understand how big of a conflict of interest there is and how big of a disconnect there is between what vendors want and need versus what customers want and need. And the reason and actually this goes beyond just vendor versus customer. This also we see this internally within and our end clients a lot too, business versus IT. It's really a business versus IT debate here. Of the technologist in me understands clean core and understands why we all want fit to standard. We don't want to customize. I get it from a tech perspective, but I also see enough business operational dysfunction to know that leads to a lot more dysfunction when you try to force fit your system into a clean core, fit to standard, vanilla cloud ERP system. You can call it best practice all you want if you're a purist, if you're an SAP or an ERP purist, but I've just seen too much reality where rubber meets the road with operations, where that generic vanilla system just cannot meet the needs of the business operations. And I think that's the real rub here.
Well, I think it really is a rub. And, the benefit to the vendor is that they get to sell, what is perceived to be, a cleaner way of integrating and implementing that software that's going to cost you less money. It's going to take less time than traditionally it would have, because they've got, I don't know, whatever you want to call it, SAP Rise, Clean Core, all these marketing buzzwords around the implementation process, which are all designed to make it seem less problematic or less complicated than it actually is, which I think does a few things. One is it sets up an unrealistic expectation that it's going to be easier or more simple than it really will be. And so the customer then devotes less resources than it otherwise would have to the implementation, thereby, creating the likelihood that implementation is going to be more difficult and take longer and have more issues than it otherwise would have. So there's that. I think, there's also this issue with, standardization, vanilla out of the box, kind of the unrealistic expectations associated with that. And, I will tell you that, when these things fail, often it's because, there was an over reliance on this out of the box mentality by the integrator or by the vendor. And then when they go live, the software doesn't do all the things that it needs to do because there wasn't appropriate customization or modification of that system to address gaps in functionality. And the response is, well, you've got to change your business to adapt to the software. And we see lawsuits like this where, well, the vendor washes, or the integrator rather, washes their hands of any problems that were supposedly in the implementation, saying, well, you didn't follow the process. You wanted to replicate what your old process did. And I think there's truth to both sides of that, saying, well, you can't over customize, and also say, well, we need to customize the system to accommodate our unique ways of doing business. And the whole irony associated with this is, if you've got some sort of secret sauce or some sort of competitive advantage, and the vendor is telling you, don't worry about that, just adopt this out of the box, uncustomized system, you're going to preserve your ability to upgrade. You're going to be, financially better off in the future. There's some truth to that. But what are you giving up? You're giving up what differentiates you from your competitors, especially in the context of artificial intelligence. If you're putting all your workflows and your processes into these tools, and they're learning based on your data, and that that output is available to everyone that's utilizing the system in your space, what have you just done to your competitive advantage and your trade secrets? That's a huge issue.
Yeah, and it is interesting, and you and I were talking about this before we came on the show live a few minutes ago. But one of the things that fascinates me is, if we back up for a second and just say, what is the job of a leader within any organization?
Right.
They are certainly responsible for saying, hey, it's time for us to modernize our tech stack, which is what a lot of leaders are finding right now. But beyond that, they also, their job, I would argue, is to protect their intellectual property, not just in a way that doesn't get them sued, which I think that's where I've, a lot of discussions I've had with you or questions I've asked you before have really centered on, data and things that you could get sued over. But here we're talking about something that's like, it's not tangible. It's not easy to see, but it's almost like you're quietly giving away, or you're slowly giving away your secret sauce. It's sort of leaking out of the organization now because you're passing it on to a vendor. You're passing it on to your competitors unknowingly, because now you've trained the AI model that the vendor uses with your competitors. You've trained that same AI model to help your competitors. It may be helping you too, but you're also helping your competitors. And you have to look at that and say, am I being a good steward of my intellectual property and my core strengths and competitive advantages and things like that? It's not, and this isn't a tech discussion. This is more of a strategic conversation. I think that's what makes it so difficult to have the conversation.
Yeah. And I think, you look at this and what are you giving up, right? You're giving up your differentiated advantage, and that essentially is disappearing into the vendor's standard configuration, right? So you've given up what makes you, a key force in your industry that differentiates you from your competitors. You've given that up for the sake of efficiency. And, what's the cost benefit analysis of that? I'm not really sure, but you've got to quantify that in some way, because I think, what executives are focusing on the bottom line of the implementation, right? They want the biggest discounts. They want the quickest time to go live. They want low costs, and you get all that, by adopting best practices, standardizations, vanilla out of the box mentality. But what's the trade-off? And I think the trade-off is, it's intangible, but it's there.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And, it's not something that shows up in a project status report or a board deck that you're going to go present to your steering committee or whatever. It doesn't show up there. And that's what makes it so tricky. But it's absolutely true. And it's absolutely happening to a lot of organizations without them realizing it. And,
Right. I mean, your unique way of operating is what makes you successful. And if you're kind of, all devolving towards this homogenous baseline where that no longer exists, that just seems fundamentally wrong.
Yeah. And one thing I've noticed too, and this again is not just the fault of software vendors, I think it's also the fault of technologists in general, even the ones that work for the end customers internally. But one thing I've noticed is this labeling or this marketing spin that the vendors have done a really nice job with. It's highly effective, but it's very destructive in my opinion. And that is to label some of your secret sauce and your intellectual property, your competitive advantage. You label that as technical debt. You say, well, that's technical debt. You built the system to do something that's unique to you, and that's just technical debt. Debt is bad. You need to get rid of it. And to me, that's really dangerous. And again, that term is brilliant. Whoever came up with that term and decided to deploy it across the industry is very smart. They know exactly what they're doing when they say technical debt, because it has such a powerful connotation. But in my opinion, it's too powerful in the wrong way, because it's focusing on the wrong thing, which is customization is bad. I need to go to a modern vanilla system. And by the way, what also gets lost in this whole thing is all you're doing is just you're building new technical debt. You're spending money on new technical debt that 5 years from now or 10 years from now, you're going to say, well, that's technical debt. We got to replace it. So you got to get out of this hamster wheel of thinking I got to get rid of technical debt because you'll never come out ahead. But that's a whole nother story. But what are your thoughts on that? I mean, it seems like, and again, this isn't necessarily something that leads to litigation or the need for an attorney, but it is very important to understand that.
Well, it does lead to litigation, and I'll tell you how. We had a lawsuit last year where we represented a distributor in the audiovisual space, and the vendor kept promising, that the software was going to meet all of their business requirements, all of their needs, and essentially what they wanted to do was just implement really what was kind of a minimally viable version of the product that would address kind of a company in the abstract that did what they did without really addressing any of the unique business processes or workflows that were unique to this company, because it was not part of the process, right? It wasn't best practice to do that, but that's what the company needed. And so you've got a situation where the gaps in functionality of what the baseline system can do are just massive, because it doesn't account for the unique ways in which this business does business. And so, that leads to allegations of fraud, negligent misrepresentation, breach of contract, breach of warranty. And it becomes difficult to defend those cases in some ways, because you're right, this term is a brilliant term, right? Technical debt. How do you argue that, all of this one-off customization that you've done to your system to account for unique ways that you do business is really efficient and a best practice? I mean, in the broad scheme, maybe it's not, but for this particular business in this particular industry, that's what differentiates them. And for them, it is a best practice. So how do you kind of balance those two needs?
Yeah.
It leads to massive problems.
Yeah. I had what I think was funny. I don't think the person I was debating with thought it was funny, but I had a debate with someone online about, I tried to turn that on its head a little bit, the technical debt concept. And I said, well, let's think of it this way. Let's think about M&A activity or companies that are highly leveraged. There's companies that have financial strategies of using debt, other people's money, to grow their companies. And so how is this any different? I mean, you can use debt debt could be a positive thing. I mean, we all as consumers think, okay, I've got a credit card balance, I've got to pay off or whatever. It's bad. But businesses do it all the time. Businesses always use debt to grow their businesses or to invest with other people's money. So I always view it as you're doing it on the financial instrument side of things. Why not do it with your technology? Is that a terrible thing? And of course, you get people that think that that's pure blasphemy that I would even say that, being in the technology industry. But it's true. I mean, you got to look at where's my real value, and where's the real payoff and where's the real risk? Because you might just be replacing, you might be replacing technical debt, but now you're creating operational debt that's really hard to get out of. And you're sort of trapped in that situation going forward.
Yeah,
I want to say, oh, go ahead, Marcus.
None of that is good, right? I mean, none of that is a benefit to the customer.
Yeah, absolutely. I want to turn to the audience. The audience has been eerily quiet. I thought I was having a technical issue, which is why I get up to get my iPad thinking I'm not seeing the stream, but now we're finally getting some questions come in here. But there's a whole thread going on LinkedIn right now about what governance framework to use for your public cloud environment and how do you ensure AI governance evolves quickly enough to keep pace with the rapid advancement of AI technologies. I'm gonna shift that into a more relevant topic for you, Marcus, which is, what are the ways that we can still leverage AI in our enterprise technology environments without giving up this control or giving up our IP in a way that helps competitors? Is there a way to use AI in a smart way that actually helps you but doesn't unintentionally help your competitors or take away from your own competitive advantage?
Yeah, and I think what you want to do is have an understanding of how their artificial intelligence tools and functionality really works. You want them to be able to explain to you, exactly what they do with the inputs and have some guardrails about what kind of inputs you're going to put into that artificial intelligence functionality. And I think, from a contract negotiation process, a governance process, if you will, which is what the contract is, I think you want to explicitly identify, whatever kind of key workflows that you have, what kind of key processes, and certainly trade secrets, with as much specificity as you can in the contract, call them out. And I think you want to carve those out of any kind of broad licenses that are granted to the vendor to utilize that information. A lot of times the utilization of that data is subject to some sort of broad definition of customer data. And it's just anything that you enter into the system and they can do with that what they want. And where that's generally problematic when it comes to some of these key pieces of information. But if you, to the extent you can carve them out from that, I think you're going to be in a better position than you otherwise would. You want to have strict use restrictions on what that vendor can do with that information, deletion obligations upon the termination of that functionality, upon deletion upon the utilization of that data. You want to be able to audit your vendor to make sure that they're complying with these contractual restrictions that you put in there. You're going to want to have confidentiality provisions that have limitations on their ability to use that data for benchmarking and the like. That's kind of where I would start. And when I think of governance, as an attorney that negotiates these contracts on a regular basis, I'm thinking of utilizing that contractual process and the framework of those contractual obligations to govern what that vendor can do with that information. And I think if you go down that path, you're setting yourself up for success.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's great advice. And here's a question that just came in on YouTube that actually is going to set up a whole array of stuff I want to cover with you, Marcus. And this is a comment from John on YouTube. He says, with your 10 worst ERP failures, could those budgets have been better spent building a custom ERP via a software firm or in-house? Amazon, Walmart, and Tesla all did. And I love this question because it's the question itself is, in my opinion, the tip of an iceberg here. Because if we really go underneath the surface here, the question now becomes, let's look at history of enterprise technology and how companies have used enterprise technologies over the last decades. Which ones have been the most effective at growing their businesses, scaling their businesses with technology? And nowhere in my research have I found that there have been some wildly successful companies that grew their companies and became wildly successful because they implemented SAP or they implemented Oracle or Microsoft E365 or something like that. It's usually they created something that is really hard to replicate. And you look at these three examples that John mentions on YouTube: Amazon, Walmart, Tesla. Those are all three really good examples of companies that did the opposite of what we're talking about here today, which is they brought all this stuff in-house and said, we're going to build our own stuff. And I know, again, this is blasphemy for a lot of the technology industry. Why would you build stuff if you could just get it off the shelf? Well, here's why. It's because you're building, you look at what, like Walmart's a great example. Walmart completely revolutionized the supply chain management function back in the 80s and 90s, early 2000s. And they became wildly successful because they were so good at supply chain management. And they didn't do it by deploying SAP. They did it by building their own system, their own supply chain network, et cetera. So anyway, the reason I bring this up is because in the past, prior to say 2020, maybe the late 20 teens, in the past, you would have your IP that you developed, your unique aspect of your ERP system. You would deploy it on-prem, you do some customization. Of course, the customization is a pain in the ass and the technologists don't like it. Vendor sometimes doesn't even like it, but you would do it a lot of times because you have a competitive advantage you're trying to retain. Sometimes, yes, you would customize things you probably shouldn't have, you didn't need to, but buried in there is probably some gems, some stuff that's unique to you. But now we're moving to a model that's moving away from that, saying, okay, customization is bad, it's technical debt. Let's go to vanilla cloud systems, SaaS, public cloud, whatever you want to call it. And now you have limited flexibility to build those competitive advantages. And I don't think we're going to see the next Walmart, Tesla, Amazon, whoever coming out of this cloud world. It's not going to be because they deployed a SaaS system. It's going to be because they did something that no one else can do that's very hard to replicate. But what are your thoughts on this when you think about intellectual property and protecting your and building your competitive strengths? How does it fit into the world of technology, in your opinion?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think if you look at that and with that analysis, I mean, I think you can't argue that Walmart, Tesla, and Amazon, haven't revolutionized the way that they've done business in those particular industries. And you're right, they didn't do that by implementing standard vanilla off-the-shelf software where the concept of technical debt was minimized and seen as bad, and they adopted SAP or Oracle's version of whatever best practices were for their particular industry. They did the things that we've been talking about, right? They embraced those things that made them unique, and whether you call that technical debt or not, it doesn't matter. There's value to that, and as an intellectual property attorney, that's where the competitive advantage is, and that's what you need to protect, because that is what differentiates you and makes you a great company. And again, if it's a race to the bottom by implementing homogenized cloud-based systems that have the same vanilla best practices for everybody, that's not doing your business any favors in some ways. I mean, I think it's efficient, it's cheap, but what are you giving up for the benefit of that efficiency gain? And you're very much giving up the future of your company in some ways. I mean, that sounds incredibly dramatic, but if you look at it in the context of this question, that's right there. And do you have, as a company, the financial resources or the technical expertise to develop a software system that is sophisticated as Amazon's or Walmart's or Tesla's? The answer is probably not, and that's why most people don't do it. And whether your budget could be better spent on that or not, it's hard to say for sure. But I will tell you, if you have an ERP failure, not only are you dealing with the cost of the failed software that allegedly does not work and you can't utilize, you're dealing with the legal fees to get to recover damages associated with that implementation, which are going to cost hundreds of thousands of dollars, and then you've got to implement a new system. So, if you look at it that way, maybe you do have the budget.
Right. Yeah, because you could end up, first of all, to be clear, you can fail. It's easy to fail no matter what you do, whether you're using vanilla ERP software or custom dev. But, certainly custom dev, things can get out of control pretty quickly in terms of, recreating the wheel, building stuff from scratch, et cetera, et cetera. Now there's hybrid ways you can do that to mitigate risk that we could come back to. But I think the key here is that you can also, what gets lost in this discussion oftentimes is you can also really screw up a project by trying to force fit a cloud system that might look on the surface easier and cheaper to implement, because technologically it probably is.
Right.
Well, that's arguable. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. But let's just say it is cheaper technologically. It might actually cost you a lot more operationally. We have a big client right now that has grown tremendously, largely due to the data center boom that's happening right now. And they've grown from right around $1 billion to $4 billion just in a handful of years. And so they've grown a lot. And we're helping them through an ERP implementation right now. And the biggest problem we're having with them right now is the front end of their configure price quote process, which is essentially the way you sell and then configure a product that you're going to deliver to an end customer. That the way they do things is so different, so unique, and they're so good at it that no off-the-shelf software seems to be working. And so we're having a lot of trouble with that. We're trying to figure out, well, we've got to customize the thing. We've got to get a bolt on. We've got to customize that. Then we've got to integrate it back to your core ERP system. And it sounds like a technologist nightmare. And in many cases it is. But we look at the other side of this. You look at what the CFO is looking at, the COO, and et cetera, et cetera. They're saying, well, that's a showstopper. We're not just going to use the system off the shelf because we don't want to change anything technologically. We need to keep our competitive advantage. Yeah. And this is one top of mind sort of thing that we're seeing right now. We see it all the time with customers. You've got to make the decision that makes the most business sense, not just look at it through the technical lens.
Yeah. And I think that gets lost, you've got all these competing pressures, but fundamentally, this is a business tool to enhance your business and to give you a competitive edge. And so if you're not getting those things out of it, then what's the point?
Yeah, exactly. When I turn to TikTok here, because I've neglected the stream here, and there's a lot of comments coming at HelloPilot says customizing Dynamics 365 these days is easy. I don't know if it's easy, but it's probably easier than it was, especially with Copilot and other AI tools you can use to be doing that. HelloPilot just makes a very wise suggestion saying that don't fail. Good advice. Do not fail. Right. Yeah. HelloPilot has all the answers. And actually, HelloPilot has another really good comment here. And thank you for the comments, HelloPilot. I'm kidding when I sound facetious like that. But HelloPilot says the market is changing. It's a mosaic world, and AI will allow easier customization. I think that's a huge point that we haven't really touched on yet. Customization is not what it used to be. It doesn't require as heavy of a lift as it used to. And now you've got more tools at your disposal to be able to customize or to custom build stuff. I'm not saying do it when you don't need to, but you've got to be strategic about when and where you do that. And there might be parts of your business where you need to do that. Are you seeing more customers that are heading down that path, or that are considering more custom build type stuff? Or
we're not necessarily seeing more custom builds. We're seeing the adoption of kind of traditional ERP systems that we've all heard about. But what we are seeing in another part of our practice is really the rise of vibe coding and software companies that are emerging, where they appear to be credible threats to enterprise technology in the value add that they say that they offer is where you can essentially vibe code an entire back-end software system to run your business. And I think that raises a tremendous amount of intellectual property and legal issues, because the way the law is structured right now with respect to intellectual property is if the AI tool has created the output, that's not protectable from an intellectual property standpoint, certainly from a copyright standpoint. And there are nuances here that I don't want to go down the rabbit holes, but as a general concept, this is accurate. And the implication for that is, okay, well, if I'm utilizing artificial intelligence tools to make customizations and modifications to address unique business processes that give me a competitive advantage, you have to understand and acknowledge that you may not own those modifications and extensions that you have developed. They may not be protectable at all. And so, what do you do with that? You've got a unique process that is protectable, that is facilitated by a piece of functionality that fundamentally is not protectable. And so anybody then could take that piece of functionality and replicate your trade secret. That's a huge issue.
That's really interesting.
Yeah.
I don't recall a client ever bringing up that topic or that question, that risk, that concern.
Yeah.
Very telling.
Nobody is thinking about that at all. And I think this area of law, intellectual property ownership with respect to artificial intelligence, is rapidly evolving. I think it's starting to kind of mature, but where it's going to end up, we're not exactly sure. But right now, the state of the law is, if there is not substantive human intervention in the development of that modification or customization, and it's done primarily by artificial intelligence, the artificial intelligence modification that you have developed is not protectable from an intellectual property standpoint. And so what does that do to your competitive advantage? So, I think AI in the context of software development is certainly transformative. And I think, it does and will make modifications and customizations easier, but the ownership of those modifications and customizations is really a question mark.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Um, there's a few questions over here on LinkedIn I want to get to in just a minute. But before I do that, one thing that I forgot to mention earlier, but it's better late than never, is that Marcus, you're going to be speaking at our annual Digital Stratosphere conference coming up in September in Denver, Colorado, September 9th through 11th. It's I think our seventh or eighth one, and you've spoken at and sponsored every single one of them. So again, not only are you the most frequent guest on this podcast, but you are also the most frequent speaker and sponsor of our Stratosphere event. You helped us put together the very first one and have done so ever since. But you're going to be speaking at it again, and Taft Law will be involved again. So really excited to have you guys, and I do want to invite the audience here to learn more about the conference, because we just published the agenda, the speaker list. You can scan this QR code right here, and it'll take you to the event page where you can learn more about that event. But you can join it in person in Denver, get to meet Marcus and I and a bunch of other speakers. If you can't be here in person, you can also join remotely. You can buy a virtual pass where we'll stream it live. We take questions from the people on the stream as well. So really hope you guys can make it. Just scan this QR code if you want to learn more about it. And it's a great event. It's a lot of fun. It's good networking, good peer networking, good lessons from other people. And it's also independent tech agnostic. So it's not meant to sell you on any software of any sort. It's meant to just help you understand some of these lessons we're talking about here today.
I can't speak, highly enough of this event. It's something we have been involved in as a firm, and me personally since the very beginning. And there's a reason for that. We believe in it. The speaker lineups are almost always amazing. You've had Jan Bond at a couple of them. His insights are always super interesting. Emma Roloff, I think, has been a past sponsor as well and speaker. I haven't looked at the lineup yet, so I'm not sure if those people are speaking this year. But you're always in for a treat. In the educational value of the conference is really high. And I think if you're about to embark on a digital transformation, you're in the middle of one, or one is on the radar, this is, I would say, a must see or must attend type of event. So what you're getting into. You've got insights from leading experts in the field. So it's a good event.
Yeah, and love to see you all there. It's a good time, and I learn a lot every time. I love doing it, and even just seeing you speak. I've seen you speak so many times. I've had you on this podcast so many times, and every single time I learn so much. So
that's cool.
Me who've heard you speak 20 times or more or whatever through conversations and presentations, I still learn. So I think no matter how smart you think you are, or that you might actually be, there's always something to learn here with this group that we have. So here's I want to get to some questions and comments here on other social media outlets here. Alina says IP stands for International Project. No, it stands for intellectual property. I can't tell if she's kidding or serious, but just in case anyone here is questioning, what does IP stand for? It's intellectual property, at least the IP we're talking about here.
Right.
Question or a comment from Serge, building on what we just talked about. Serge on LinkedIn says, if the make or buy analysis says build, you should build. The one caveat I'd throw in here to what you're saying, Serge, I totally agree with you. I would just say the analysis itself needs to be done by someone other than your software vendor that's trying to sell you software, because they're gonna put together a business case that's going to show you how amazingly powerful that ROI is going to be if you don't build, if you just use the buy aspect of things. And the other thing too, one thing I haven't mentioned that I think is worth noting here is when we talk about build and buy, it's not either or necessarily. There's a hybrid, sort of a gray area too. You could do a partial, buy a platform, like for example, Salesforce. You can go buy Salesforce as your CRM system, but then you also have access to the entire platform of third-party apps and tools you can use to either build your own apps on the Salesforce platform, even outside of CRM, or you can go find someone else who's built a third-party app on that platform. So you can do it in a way that leverages common tools and gets you out of that risk of having this system that only you know how to operate, because you have other people in the ecosystem that know how to use it. So there is a hybrid there you can do too, which I think a lot of companies gloss over, don't realize. Let's see. Oh, here's a good question that's right up your alley, Marcus. This is from John on YouTube. John says, If you're implementing a major off-the-shelf enterprise software system, is it a best practice to hire a contract or governance attorney? If so, how and where in the world could I find one? I'm sure you have some thoughts on this, Marcus.
Yeah, look, you need to hire somebody that's experienced in contracts. Ideally, it should be an attorney, but I think what you really want is you want kind of have a three-tiered structure to the way that you're going to adopt the software. You want to have, in my view, some sort of, I would say, a tech agnostic consulting company that is going to help you select the software, develop an RFI or an RFP, something along those lines. And this is best practice. I don't think you need to do all of these things every time, but certainly this is the way you should do it, in my view. And Eric, maybe you might disagree or have some additional tips. So I think getting somebody to help you with selecting the software that is going to be a good fit for you is important. And then you're certainly going to want to have somebody that is going to review that contract from a legal perspective. This is a specialized industry, and I think you're going to need to do a search engine search for firms that practice ERP, contract negotiation law. There aren't a ton of them, so you're going to have a handful of choices. I think then you're going to want to vet them, get customer references, client references, and get a good fit, understand the way that they look at these agreements. And again, you want somebody that is going to be able to point out issues, but really, look at those issues from a practical perspective, holistic perspective, understand the risk that they present, and give you good, solid advice. Just because something is a risk for most of their clients doesn't mean it's a risk for you. And so it's not a cookie cutter approach necessarily. And then I think you're going to want to go back, to some sort of an expert that's going to be able to advise you on pricing, discounts, see if you're getting a good deal, and trying to negotiate that type of a structure. The attorneys are going to be able to give you general advice around, what they think a deal looks like, but that's not really in their wheelhouse. They're not so concerned about the numbers and, the kinds of future options that you're getting and whether it's a good deal or not. Somebody like a Gartner or somebody along those lines, I think, is probably a good option. So yeah, you do need, experts on your side. And you've got to understand too, the contract that you're going to get from any vendor is going to be one-sided, unreasonable, shift all the risk of that software acquisition or implementation to you and minimize their risk. And if something goes sideways during the implementation or your use of that software, that contract's not going to serve you very well if it hasn't been reviewed and negotiated. And again, you're trying to give yourself a dog in the fight by modifying that contract in a way that gives you some leverage and really functions as a tool to govern your relationship with that particular vendor for the duration of the project and for your use of that software. So that's how you do it, in my view.
Yeah, and I think one thing that along those lines too is that, and I totally agree with everything you just said. And what it triggered in my mind though was how what you said is even more true today than it would have been 5 or 10 years ago, which it would have been true then too, but even more so today because the enterprise technology space, in my opinion, is becoming a lot less flexible than it used to be. Yes. Not just in terms of the software itself, but contractually too. Right. Contractually, you have less leeway. In fact, we were talking about this before we went live on the air as well. Tell me what your thoughts are. Like, what trends are you seeing from a contractual leverage and negotiation perspective as it relates to software vendors here in 2026?
Yeah, and that really comes down to the question of how negotiable are these contracts and how much can you change? And it really comes down to, a key element, and that's how much money you're spending, right? If you're spending $100 million with SAP or Oracle, they're going to be a lot more flexible in dealing with requested changes to those contracts than if you're spending $100,000. And I think if you're on the lower end of the software spend, the reality is you don't have a lot of leverage, and the likelihood it's going to be more of a take it or leave it kind of attitude is really high. If you're spending a reasonable amount of money, on a critical piece of software that's going to run your business, you want to make sure that you know what to ask for. And you need somebody experienced in this. I'm not trying to tout my experience or say, pick me for this, but you're going to want to be dealing with somebody that knows how Microsoft operates from a contractual standpoint. You're going to want to know or deal with somebody that knows how Oracle or NetSuite operates and what they can ask for, based on the leverage that you have. And it's highly inflexible right now. And the mantra from most of these vendors is, well, we don't change our software because this is a delivery model that is company wide and across our customer base, so we can't accommodate one-offs. That is a lie. Okay, that is not true. Certainly, you're going to be able to modify warranty obligations. You're going to be able to modify limitations of liability, put carve-outs in there for data security breaches, confidentiality disclosures, those types of things. You're going to want to have solid remedies for breaches of warranties. You're going to want to be able to get out of that contract and know what happens, get your data out of that contract. So, I mean, there's a lot that can be negotiated. You just need to know what to ask for, and what a vendor is most likely going to accept. And that's where, the real value add utilizing people that have done this before comes from.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And I think, this is becoming even more true as well over time because, I think you look at the mass amounts of money that are to be made in the enterprise technology space. That's when you start to see irrational. Well, it's actually very rational, but it may seem irrational to people like you and I, Marcus, because we look at it more from the customer perspective, and you think, well, why would a vendor do this? And then if you stop to think, you're like, well, it's because they're going to make so much money.
Yeah.
If I can get everyone to a homogeneous model, if I can get everyone onto my cloud SaaS solution, it's easy for me. I can scale that. I'm more profitable. Investors love it. I get heavily compensated as an executive if I can get more people on this recurring subscription model. So there's a lot of money that drives irrational, but also very rational behavior that, in my opinion, harms customers. And I think more than ever, you need someone who's just on your side. They're not here to make vendors happy or to have a bias for or against any one vendor. It's more about the only bias. You should have advisors whose only bias is to make sure you succeed. That's all that matters. It doesn't matter what software you buy. It doesn't matter how you do it or how you get there. It's more, are you going to succeed or not? And that's where I think people like you and I can help.
Yeah, 100% agree with that.
Yeah. John said, thank you, gentlemen, on your time and advice. FYI, I ordered your first book, EK. Thank you for buying it. Buy all three while you're at it. I'll sign them for you if you do that. So, but that's a good start to buy the first one. Lena said, thanks for the clarification. Has to drop off. She wants me to like and comment on her post. And everyone watching here, if you follow Lena Karloviskia on LinkedIn, be sure to like and comment on her post. And then one last question, and then we'll wrap it up here, Marcus. But this is an interesting thing because I think this is a good question, but it also raises doubt to what you and I have been talking about here today. And this is from Lean on LinkedIn. Lean says, but who's responsible for AI vibe code when things go wrong? And this is a valid point, but I also think that it's a big enough fear that a lot of companies will say what you just said, Marcus, and what you said, Eric, about custom build and, creating your own proprietary technologies. It's a terrible idea because I don't want to have to manage that going forward. Especially if I build it using vibe code or whatever. Yeah. What are your thoughts on this? I mean, it is a risk. It's a real cost, but how do you navigate that?
Well, I mean, again, I don't want to go back to the contract, but I will. And if you look at the disclaimers, the limitations of liability, the indemnity obligations in these types of contracts, and I'm talking about AI contracts specifically, and contracts in the ERP space that are dealing with AI functionality, they disclaim almost all responsibility associated with artificial intelligence outputs, which is what we're talking about. In my view, I mean, you can go a few different ways with this contract, or this comment rather. But if you put in certain inputs to generate code, and that outputted code is problematic, be assured that vendor is going to wash their hands of any responsibility for it. So who's on the hook when things go wrong for that? You are. And you're not going to have very many contractual rights to go after the vendor if their contractual obligations are going to end with their build of the system, the functionality that you're utilizing to generate the outputs. That's not true with every vendor, and there's ways to get around that from a contractual perspective. But this is why it becomes important for somebody to look at these documents, because they can account for these things and try to give you, some reasonable path forward if something does go sideways. And I don't. It's going to be challenging to hold any AI vendor's feet to the fire for outputs that go sideways. But there is language that you can put into those contracts that is going to mitigate your exposure. To their ability to just walk away, and you maximize your ability to hold them accountable for it.
Yeah. So what That's good advice. What advice would you give if you could, just as a capstone closing question here, if you could spend 60 seconds in a boardroom with the executive team as they're making their decision to move forward with the digital transformation or a big IT investment of some sort, what would the headline advice be that you would give to an executive team as it relates to all the stuff we're talking about here today?
I would dumb it down and I would say, think about two things primarily. Think about flexibility and think about control. Okay. You want to be able to utilize the software in ways that make sense for your business. So that gives you the flexibility. All right. Flexibility meaning that you can run your business the way you want to run your business, embracing your technical debt to the extent that it makes sense, and flexibility to avoid revenue generating events that are unexpected in input on to you by that vendor. You're going to want to have some clarity as to what your costs are going to be over the lifetime or the life cycle of your utilization of that software tool. And then with respect to control, it really is, how do I control my data? How do I control what I'm putting into that system? How do I get it out? What costs are there associated with me utilizing my data in that system, and what's the value add? So for me, at a 10,000 foot level, it's really flexibility and control. And if you focus on those two things fundamentally, everything else should fall into place.
Yeah. 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 Good. I like that. Flexibility and control. I mean, if there's two things you walk away with in this conversation, I think those two things are really good ones. And I think it's two things that a lot of leaders don't want to hear, or maybe they're afraid of. They're afraid of the flexibility and they're afraid of the control, because it's a lot easier if I don't have flexibility. When I say it's a lot easier, I mean, on the surface, short term, it's a lot easier if I just let a vendor handle that for me. Just give me best practice, give me the software the way it will help me run my business better. That's the easy answer. Unfortunately, that world does not exist, even though vendors try to sell it to you. So you got to get over that and say, okay, that doesn't exist. So let's go ahead and figure out a way that we're going to retain flexibility and control. I think the control is a big one. I'm fascinated. I don't know if it's a new generation of leaders that's causing this, if it's a cultural phenomena, or if it's just the software vendors are doing such a good job selling it. But companies are giving up a lot of control, not just about IP, not just about their own intellectual property, but just about like how they run these projects and,
Right.
outsourcing the entire project to a Big Four consultancy. I've just never seen such flippant behavior, on the part of leaders. And I'm broadly generalizing. This isn't true across the board, but I see it a lot more, I feel like, today than I did 10 years ago. And I'm not sure why that is. I don't know if you have an opinion on that, but that's just more of an observation.
I don't know what that is. I don't know if it's company culture. I don't know if it's a cultural thing, a generational shift, like you said. I was dealing with this yesterday. We've got a Fortune 100 company whose name, if I said it, everybody would know, that's doing a massive SAP implementation, over $20 million. And they're spending, I think, 40 with one of the big 5 consulting firms. And this SOW shifts almost all of the responsibility for that project to this client. And getting the firm to beat them back on this has been incredibly difficult. The consultant doesn't want to accept any of the language, and the client's like, well, we're just going to take the operational risk, and it's going to work out. Well, this goes counter to everything that we want to do. I mean, hold them accountable, make them responsible. What are you paying them for? And you read the statement of work, and it's not even clear what services they're providing. They're going to leverage and utilize their implementation methodology, pursuant to your direction, and you maintain responsible for all the decisions associated with the implementation project. Okay, well, what are you hiring them for?
Right. Yeah.
Utilization of a methodology doesn't really say anything. It's about as specific as that.
Yeah. Well, and if you're still not convinced that your points, Marcus, flexibility and control are important, maybe this will help. Just think about this as I don't want to end it on a negative note, but it is worth noting that when you look at hiring a big consultancy and or a software vendor for these projects, there's 2 of the 3 parties involved here that are guaranteed success. Right. The vendor and your consultants are guaranteed to come out ahead. They will be profitable. They will make money. They'll make a lot of money off of you. The person that is bearing all the risk, and when I say all the risk, I'm not even talking contractual. I'm just talking about the operational risk, the reality of what you have to live with longer term. when things go south, you are the one that has to deal with that. Now, sure, you could go sue your vendor if you want. You could hire Marcus and go get some extract some concessions out of them, and that might be the path for some of you. But you're still not coming out ahead. The vendor and the consultants will come out ahead, and that should be concerning to every executive. You should think, well, then why wouldn't I want flexibility and control? If I'm the one taking on the operational risk, I have to live with this for decades to come. These decisions I'm making today, I better do it in a way that I have ownership of, I have control over, and it gives me the most amount of flexibility longer term.
Exactly.
Yeah, good deal. Well, thanks for joining today, Marcus. Really appreciate it. It's good having
you.
Yeah, very good. And again, if you want to learn more, go to Stratosphere, scan this QR code to learn more about our Stratosphere conference coming up. You can meet Marcus there. You can meet me there. We'll both be keynote speakers. You'll get a chance to network with us and a bunch of other speakers, other peers going through the same thing as you are. So be sure to join us in Denver, September 9 to 11. If you can't be here in Denver physically, you can join us remotely, virtually as well. So be sure to scan the QR code before you go here. And thank you all for being here today. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next week, same time, same place. And we'll see y'all soon. Take care.
All right. Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
All right, thanks. Bye.